Welcome everyone to the 4D monthly webinar series, Preparing for 4D v14 Journaling. Your hosts for today's webinar are myself, Erin Moeller, 4D Marketing Manager, and Brian Young, 4D Technical Marketing Manager. Brian?
Thanks, Erin. Let's get this slide to work here. Come on. Okay, we're going to make this introduction quick. We're going to have a 40-minute presentation after by Josh, and we're leaving 20 minutes for the Q&A at the end. We have a lot of new people today. We've got a good turnout. I just want to remind everybody that you can ask questions throughout the webinar by using the GoToWebinar window. Click down here and add your question. We will go over those at the end.
Our speaker for today's webinar is Josh Fletcher, 4D Technical Account Manager. Josh.
Thank you, Erin and Brian. Give us just a moment to switch control, to give me power.
Let's switch the machines over here.
We'll get started.
So today, I'm going to talk about preparing for journaling in v14. I'm actually talking about three main topics today. Number one, journaling itself. What do I mean by journaling? What's changed? I'm going to cover that briefly. Next, I'm going to talk about the changes that you need to make in development to take advantage of the new journaling. So there is some work to do. And finally, I'm going to talk about the impact of those changes when you go to deploy v14. So up first, talk about journaling. What do I mean by journaling? Now, I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence here. I think probably most of you know about the journaling feature in 4D. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. That's all. So when I say journaling, I'm referring to the setting in the database settings under backup configuration that says use log file. So sometimes it's called the log file, sometimes it's called the journal. The extension on the file is .journal. So log and journal, I mean, you can use the two terms interchangeably with 4D. That's the feature. So of course, it manifests itself on the machine, on the computer, with an actual file, .journal, that lives with your database, with your application. So what gets journaled? What does this feature do? Every creation, update, or deletion of data gets placed in the journal file. That's what's in there. There's also some other information that gets logged in there that's not necessarily critical to today's topic, but like opening and closing the database, things like that get logged. But they're not critical to the journal. So the journal tracks changes. That's the first thing that it does. It's a logically complete record of all the changes to the database. One of the most important things about the journal is how it's written to. So in general, 4D has three ways of writing changes in a database. The journal is one, and that lives on the disk. The cache, the database cache, is another, and the cache is in memory. And finally, the data file itself, which is also on disk. So there's three different ways that 4D writes changes to the data. But the important thing here is the order in which this happens. When a change happens, 4D writes it to the journal first. It writes it to the cache second. And at some point, depending on your settings, the cache gets flushed. The change gets flushed to disk. So the important thing here today is that the journal is the first commit. So that's why this feature is so critical to 4D systems, is the journal is where the change gets written first. And thus, the point of the feature, or one of the points of the feature, is the ability to do recovery. So if a database fails in some way and it's not usable, well, we can throw it away. We can grab a backup of that database. We can launch the backup, select the journal, and integrate all of the changes that were there. Now, this isn't the only recovery scenario, of course, but just an example of why the feature is important. The feature is, in fact, quite critical. Now, in addition to recovery, we actually extended the journaling feature, the same mechanism that gets used for recovery, in order to do mirroring. So I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail about mirroring today. It's just a reminder that the journal is also fundamental to the mirroring feature. The mirroring feature is simply you take the journal from one system, you move it to another system, and you integrate the changes. That's in a nutshell, that's what mirroring is in 4D. So the journal is critical in in 4D, not necessarily just v14, but in all versions. So what's different about v14? Now, it's important for me to point out that today's session is not about explaining the new feature. If you want to know about the new feature, if you want to know what the benefits are, if you want to know how it compares to previous versions, there is a presentation that our CTO, Laurent Ribardier, gave at the 4D Summit in the US and also the 4D Summit in Europe. And he goes through all those details. So I definitely recommend watching that presentation to learn about those details. The reason why I'm giving you two links, the US version was presented in English. It was not professionally shot, so it's just a video camera of Laurent speaking. The 4D Summit Europe version was pro shot, so it actually cuts back and forth between his slides and himself, but it's dubbed. It's presented in French and dubbed in English. So it's kind of just two different ways to learn about the information. I kind of prefer listening to Laurent speak, so I usually watch the US one, but anyway, feel free to check those out. We will put these links up again also at the end of the presentation, so if you didn't get a chance to write them down, don't worry about it. We'll have it later, and we'll also send it out in a follow-up email. So what am I talking about today? If I'm not going to talk about the new journaling feature, I want to talk about one specific aspect of the new journaling. So to give you a contrast, in v13, the journaling is based on record numbers. When I say based on record numbers, what I mean is if you go in the Maintenance and Security Center, like I have here, and you open the activity analysis pane, you will see that for each line that is modifying some data, there is a number in that column, record/blob. That's actually the record number for that record. In v14, the journaling does not use record numbers. It uses primary keys. So looking at the same pane in the Maintenance and Security Center, instead of seeing a number there, you actually see a value there. And whether it's an integer or a UUID, you'll see the primary key values show up there. So that's the main focus, the jumping off point for this webinar is there's a change when you move to v14. Primary keys are mandatory in v14. Okay. So that brings me to the first main subject for today, which is the changes that you need to make in development, centered around primary keys. Now, I'm going to do just a quick overview here of what I mean by primary key. And again, the goal is not to insult anyone's intelligence. You guys are database developers. I'm sure you already have an understanding of what a primary key is. There's a specific change that needs to be made that I need to identify. So to get us all on the same page, I'll talk about primary keys first. So here I've got kind of a typical database setup with a customer table, an invoice table, and a line item table. And in particular, the invoice table in the middle there has a field called ID. And you might imagine the idea behind the ID field is it's a unique identifier for every record in that table. So is invoice ID a primary key? From a database design standpoint, absolutely not. And I'll tell you why. So first, what is a primary key? A primary key is a value that uniquely identifies every record. Yes, this is true, but there's a fundamental difference between an ID and a primary key. So like an invoice, you can imagine in a deployed database, you might generate an invoice that has a problem, and so you decide to delete that invoice and generate another one. And you might even decide to reuse the invoice ID. So as a business rule decision, that's okay. You can do that. But primary keys must not change. By doing that, by deleting an invoice, creating an invoice, and reusing an ID, you're creating a new object, a new entity, but reusing an old value. You don't want to do that with primary keys. So to some extent, this is a philosophical discussion. There's nothing that technically prevents you from changing a primary key value. But the point is, if you embrace that a primary key must be unique and must not change, you'll be in a much safer situation. So the reason why invoice ID is not a primary key is a primary key should not be derived from application data. it should be derived separate from the application data such that it never gets changed. It's never subject to business rules. This is often called a surrogate key, as someone was kind enough to point out to me on the iNug recently. And I know also from the same iNug thread that a lot of you are already aware of this. You've already run into this challenge. You know that you need surrogate keys. And so you've built that already. So here's the same example, but augmented with a new field called GUID, which would be, the globally unique identifier. And this would be a new field. Maybe it has UUIDs in it, and it's completely separate from all the other fields in that table, and it's never used by a user, it's never changed by a user, it's never seen by a user. And a lot of you have already done this. I saw from the iNug thread, you've already done this kind of work. And so as far as many of you are concerned, you already have primary keys. So is, in this example, invoice GUID a primary key? Well, no, not yet. So right now, right here, is one of the most important aspects for why I wanted to do this webinar. Yes, you've got surrogate keys and you understand what a primary key is, but in order to make it a primary key for 4D, you have to do one more thing. You have to right-click on that field and choose Create Primary Key. So when I say primary keys are required, I'm not talking about the database concept of a primary key, really. What I'm talking about is there's a setting in 4D that you have to turn on to tell 4D, hey, this is a primary key. Now I feel fairly comfortable in saying most of you probably haven't done that. And the reason for that is you've simply never needed to. This has never been required before. The feature has actually been there. The ability to create a primary key has been there since v11, but there's no reason really to do it up to v14. So once you do it, you'll see in the structure editor that primary key fields are underlined. That's a visual indication. And also in the inspector, down there on the bottom in the inspector pane, there'll be the keywords that define this thing, and one of those is primary key. So once again, primary keys are mandatory in v14, which means you have to go through every single table in your database and set a primary key for each table. So that's the development work that I've kind of been building up to talking about. I showed you one way to do it, which is use the structure editor. Right-click on each table, set a primary key. Now, some of you probably with larger databases might have started panicking. Luckily, that's not the only way to do it. So we certainly don't expect you to go through the structure editor and browse through and find all your tables. Depending on how organized you are, that might be kind of difficult. We're very cognizant of the fact that we're asking you to do some work. You can see the proof of that in this webinar, for one. Number two, we've added a feature to help you with this. So option number 2 is called the Primary Key Manager. It's a new feature in v14. So when you launch a database in v14, converted, I mean, you've got journaling enabled, but you don't have primary keys, you'll see a dialog like this when you first launch. And it's attempting to explain that, hey, there's something different in v14, and we've detected some problems. And if you click the details button, it'll tell you what it found. It'll tell you which tables are missing primary keys but have journaling enabled. If you click the Run Assistant button, it opens up this new dialog called the Primary Key Manager. And this is basically a list view or a tabular view of your structure, of all the tables in your structure. It's an alternative way of looking at that. So it'll have all the tables in the database, and it'll give you the option to either use an existing field to create a primary key or create a new field to create a primary key. If you create a new field, you've got two choices. You can do long int or UUID. You can set the name. Otherwise, you can choose an existing field. And this feature has some intelligent behavior also for databases where it'll go through the table and it'll look for likely candidates to be primary keys, like fields that are indexed and unique and not null. And it'll suggest that for you, but you can change it, of course. In other words, if you have a larger database with a lot of tables, this will give you a way to scroll through all these tables and make this change and apply the change. So that's not the only option. Again, if you have a very large database, let me go back. I actually sat through this dialog for a database with 255 tables. It was annoying to have to scroll through 255 tables and make a setting. It was even more annoying because I screwed up and had to do it again. So we have a third option, of course, which is you can use SQL. The data definition language in 4D allows you to either set an existing field to be a primary key. That's the first example here. So alter table, add primary key, and you pass in the name of the field. Or you can alter table and create a brand new field and set that brand new field to be a primary key. So the third option is to do it with SQL and thus do it programmatically. Okay, a bit about primary keys in 4D. So they must be longint or UUID. They can optionally be auto increment or auto UUID. Those are the settings in the property list. The keyword for auto UUID if you're using SQL is auto_generate. For auto increment, it's just auto increment. They must be unique, of course. They must reject null input. So in other words, you can't have any records with nulls. And they must be indexed. Now I put a star on there for a couple of reasons. So let's look at that. If you create a new table in v14, or you use the primary key manager to assign a primary key, the index type will be automatic. On the other hand, in 4D, I think since around v12, if you set a field to be unique, 4D automatically assigns or creates a B-tree index on that field the next time you restart the database. Now, why do I mention that? If you set a field to be a primary key through one of the other techniques I mentioned, either through the structure editor or through SQL, it automatically turns on unique, which means the next time you restart the database, you're automatically going to get a B-tree index. So my point here is really just if you see in some cases you've got automatic, in some cases you've got B-tree, this is why, that's all. The fact is, in the end, the automatic index is a B-tree. So it's functionally, there's no difference functionally at all, because the B-tree is the most optimized index for a unique field anyway. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay. So this is just another view of the same information. So looking on the left, I've got a UUID field that is a primary key, and on the right, I've got a longint field that is a primary key. So you can see unique can't be turned off, reject null can't be turned off. There's B-tree index on either one. Even if you drop that index, the next time you restart 4D will automatically add one back. Okay. So you've got three options for creating primary keys. Three main options. You can use the structure editor. That's convenient, I think, for small applications. The fact is, it may be easy for you to just go in and right-click on each one and create primary keys and get on with your life, and that's totally fine. You can use the primary key manager. I think it's convenient for small to medium applications where you don't have too many tables to scroll through and make the change. So again, go ahead and use it. It's convenient, it's there, it'll help. For large applications, SQL might be the better option. Number one, because you can write the code instead of having to scroll and click and scroll and click, you could just use an array of table names and loop over the table names and create primary keys, that kind of a thing, so you can automate it. It's very, very, very convenient to use SQL if you're just going to create new fields anyway, because you're going to create new field names, and like for me, when I do it, I just use the same field name for every table. So I just hard code the field name, and I don't even need an array for the field names. I just do it. But there's another really, really important aspect. I think a divergence between if you use the structure editor or the primary key manager versus SQL. And that is, what if you have to do it more than once? Maybe you have multiple applications, multiple 4D code bases where you need to enable primary keys, or maybe you're just going to convert more than once, so you need to run it more than once. If you use the structure editor or the primary key manager, it's a human doing it. There's no way to really replay it back other than like recording a macro or something. So if you do it with code, you can run the code over and over and over again. And I think that's a really strong advantage to doing it with SQL. So just to give you an idea, here's that SQL code that I popped up earlier for creating a brand new field. Instead of doing it once, just write a loop. Use get last table number, do a for loop, check to see if the table number is valid, and then build up a statement, alter table with the table name, add a new field, and like I said, I'm hard coding the field. There's my auto generate keyword and my primary key keyword, and just run it. And you run that code, you create all your primary keys, and you're good to go, and you can do it over and over again. So that's really nice to have. That being said, at some point, you convert to v14, you do all your primary key development work, your structure's ready to go. What's next? Well, we need to deploy that new version to our customers. And so this is, I think, point number 2 for the webinar. Point number 1 was to be aware of the development work that needs to happen. Point number 2 is, what's the impact of doing this? What do I mean by deployment? Fundamentally, what I mean is take a v14 structure file and open a v13 data file, or older versions. So especially for those of you who have multiple deployments, at some point you're going to have the new structure opening old data. Even if you have a single deployment, you probably work offline when you're doing development. You don't work on the production system, so at some point you're going to open that production data file. So the key thing is, when this happens, when you open the old data file, 40v14 does primary key validation. And I'll explain what that is. Primary key validation consists of 2 checks. Check for nulls, in other words, for every table in the database, check every single record and make sure none of them are null. And check for duplicate values. So for every table in the database, check every record and make sure there's no duplicates. When I say every record, I just want to be clear. I'm talking about the primary key field, and of course not every field in the table. There's actually one other thing that the validation does that's kind of handy. If there are null values, it will replace them for you, and I'll explain that in just a second. I want to point out one thing before I do that. Checking for nulls is a sequential search on every single table in the database. So in other words, for every table in the database, 40 loads every record into the cache and checks to make sure none of them are null. Checking for duplicates is an indexed search. So for every table in the database, for every primary key field, we load the index and we make sure there's no duplicates. So you can imagine, especially in a larger database, this takes time. And that is why I'm doing this webinar. I want to make sure everybody understands how this works and has an idea of what the impact will be. And we'll look at that. So I just said I wanted to explain one other little thing about the automatic null replacement. For your primary key fields, if you choose auto UUID or auto increment, and then you open that data file, and 40 is going through and it's validating the primary keys, when it encounters a null, it'll actually replace the value for you. So it's very convenient if you're using auto-generated primary keys, because 40 will manage all that data for you. So that's really cool, actually, I think. Okay, so I said this is going to take some time. I think we need to frame this. We need to understand, what do I mean? What do you mean it's going to take time, Josh? How much time? So let's look at that. So I did some benchmarks. So my first benchmark scenario is going to be, I used the primary key manager in a v14 copy of my database. I created brand new primary key fields, auto-generated UUID primary key fields, so I didn't have to worry about the data. I deployed it, meaning I opened my very large v13 data file, and I measured the time it took for 40 to do the primary key validation. The machine setup for these benchmarks, just so you know, I'm using Windows 7. It's an Intel i7-4770, which is a quad-core processor at 3.4 gigahertz. I have 32 gigabytes of RAM and a Samsung 840 Pro SSD, 500 gigabyte SSD. It's one of the fastest consumer SSDs there is. This is not server class hardware in the sense of robustness and redundant power supplies and things like that, but I think it's pretty good hardware to give us a good real world kind of timings for this kind of a test. Okay, the first database that I use to test, I call it database A. It's an 8 gigabyte data file. It's got 255 tables. I actually created this database in 2004 and ran it up to the maximum number of tables. I wanted to make sure that I was having a true conversion experience that you might have, so that by the time I get to v14, it's actually really a converted database. It's got 12,000 plus fields, between 50 and 100 fields per table roughly, and it's got about 5 million records. Now, the records are distributed sort of non-linearly. I've got 5 or 6 tables that are really large, and then a bunch of tables that are pretty small. And I've found over the years that I think that's pretty representative of what real databases look like. So I ran the test. Benchmark number 1, brand new primary key fields, launch it in v14. How long does it take to do the validation? So it took 14 minutes and 43 seconds. That's really not that bad at all. So yes, it takes some time. For this particular database, it didn't take that much time. It's not too bad. But I realized, of course, that database A is very synthetic. I generated all the records using some loops, one after another. So for example, it has almost no fragmentation. I checked the table fragmentation and they were almost all 0. I used alpha fields for everything just to make my life easier because I created so many fields. They're all alphas. So this is really almost an idyllic situation where the data is very well structured, there's no fragmentation. It's like the fastest of the fast. And I realized that's not going to be sufficient to really explain this to you guys. So I did another database. I found actually a customer database, so a real world example. It's a 30 gigabyte data file. It's got 120 tables, 1,440 fields, and a little over 13 million records. But perhaps more importantly, I checked the fragmentation, and I had some decent fragmentation going on. It wasn't freshly compacted, and there were, let's see, 3 tables with over 1 million records that that had some decent fragmentation. So, and just a reminder, if you want to check your fragmentation, the command is get table fragmentation. I think it was introduced in v12. So database B for me was certainly more real world, and I thought this would give me a better idea of how long the primary key validation might take. So same benchmark, I created new fields in v14, set them to auto-generate, fired it up with the data file, and measured the time. Took about 1 hour and 20 minutes. So now we're getting somewhere. With database B, 1 hour and 20 minutes, that's a 30 gigabyte data file. We have customers with 100 gigabyte plus data files. So if we extrapolate, we could see a 100 gigabyte data file going 2, 3, 4 hours maybe. Now, I want to be clear that, so of course it takes time, yes, but what am I really talking about? I'm talking about downtime. Because when 40 is validating the primary keys, the application is not available. So if it's client server, it cannot accept client connections. If it's single user, the GUI hasn't loaded yet. So the system is actually down. For the 15-minute example, that's probably not a big deal. You expect that when you deploy a new version of 4D, you've got some time either to rebuild indexes or to deal with a new feature or whatever. There's going to be some downtime. But if I've got a 100 gigabyte data file and it's going to take 3 or 4 hours, that can get a bit more significant. That may not be acceptable. It depends on what your maintenance window is. Okay, so first, I want everybody to be aware that there's some potential downtime, but all is not lost. This is not the only way we can do the update. So option number 1 was create brand new fields in v14 and let 40 fill in all the data. It turns out that letting 40 fill in all the data is time consuming. So I did some other tests. Option number 2 is, instead of creating brand new fields, why don't I choose existing fields to be my primary keys, existing fields that already have data, and see how that works. So I did that. So scenario number 2, again, I just used the primary key manager in v14, enabled primary keys for using existing fields, deployed it, and measured the time that it took. So database A, the 8 gigabyte one, how long did it take? It took about 2 minutes. That's pretty good, certainly better than 15 minutes. But I think both of those are pretty fast to begin with. What about database B, the larger one, the 30 gigabyte one? That took about 15 minutes versus 1 hour and 20 when I asked 4D to automatically create the data. When all I asked 4D to do was validate the existing data, it was much, much, much faster. That's good. That's great. So what we know is if we choose existing fields, we have a shorter validation. That's good. We want to know that. Why wouldn't you just do that always? Well, the thing about doing that, the thing about choosing your existing fields is it's a little bit riskier. I'll explain why. One of the things I haven't talked about yet is, what if the primary key validation fails? Well, if it does fail, you get a dialog. So once the validation is finished, the first thing you'll see is this dialog. It's a warning. It's basically telling you 4D detected some problems. If you click the details button, it will tell you which tables had the problem. So for example, in my test here, one of my tables had duplicate values in a primary key field. But the most important thing, I think, is if 4D has a problem validating the primary keys, it turns the log file off. Now, in development, that wouldn't be a big deal. But remember, I'm talking about deployment. You don't necessarily have copies of all of your customer data files in-house in development for you to do this, right? You're going to be deploying in the field. So we're at a customer site, we're deploying a v14 update. v14 detected a problem and it turned the journal file off. Well, now my customer database is running without a journal file in production. That's not good. So that's the risk I'm talking about, is if you choose existing fields, you want to make absolutely sure there are no errors in those fields before you move to v14, in my opinion, because if you move to v14 and there's errors, the journaling is going to be turned off. And there's a second aspect, because these are very simple failures, meaning a null value or a duplicate value. You can fix that. You could fix that while you were deploying, of course. That's not a big deal, really. You search for the nulls, you put some values in, you go on your way. You go in, you want to turn the journal back on. But remember, if you turn the journal back on, you have to do a backup. So you are down for the primary key validation. You're also down now for a backup. How long is that going to take? And so that's, again, the risk that I'm talking about is this iterative process. It also can be pretty risky. But again, that's not the only solution. So option number 3 is, what if instead of creating primary keys in v14, why don't I create them before v14? As I mentioned earlier, you've had the ability to create primary keys since v11. So instead of waiting until v14, you could actually start now. You could go into your current database and start creating primary keys. You can validate the data, of course, in v11, v12, and v13. You can check for nulls, you can check for duplicates. You can do all of that ahead of time. The difference is, now you have control. And here's what I mean by that. For example, you can validate the data at your own pace. You don't have to do it right there when you convert to v14 all at once. You can validate it in pieces as you release updates to customers. However you want to do it, you're in control. You can create primary keys at your own pace. You could do 10 tables at a time. You could do one table at a time. You could do it when users aren't logged into the system. You have complete control as the developer, since you can create these through SQL. Even if you do this, even if you do all the prep work in v13, I want to be clear that when you move to v14, 4D is still going to validate the primary keys. But as I've already shown you, the fastest validation is when we're validating existing fields. So let me say that just one more time to be clear. Even if you already have primary keys defined in v13 or v12 or v11, v14 is still going to validate them. It's important before we move forward, before we move on into v14, that we make sure that data is correct. So that's why it's doing that. So this technique will give you at least give you the benefit of the fastest validation, and it will minimize your downtime risk. Going into v14, you know your data is valid. It's not going to fail. You're not going to lose your journal file. And you'll be on your way. Okay, I know that's a lot of, and of course, this is a lot more work. This option is a lot more work. I'm not trying to gloss that over. So I've given you a lot of information here. I want to summarize the primary key creation options. Option 1, create brand new fields. Use the primary key manager if you want. Use SQL if you want. Either way. This is completely convenient and valid if the primary key validation step is acceptably fast. So for my 8 GB database, this is what I would do. I would create brand new fields. I would let 4D fill in the data because it only took 15 minutes anyway. It's not a big deal. So that's fine. Choose that option if it makes sense to you. Yeah. And of course, if it's auto-generate, not only is 4D going to fill in the data for you when you convert, but from then on, of course, as you create new records, the IDs are automatically generated. You never have to worry about it. So that's great. Option number 2, in v14, create primary keys using existing fields. That gives you the fastest validation, as I said, but it increases your downtime risk when you're deploying in case something goes wrong. Now, you would probably, of course, choose option number 2 if you've already got surrogate keys. And again, that's fine. If it makes sense to you, if you already have them, that's what you want to do. You want to use your existing data. The one thing I would add as a caveat, even though you already have your own fields, is consider using the auto-generate settings. Because 4D will manage the values for you, you won't have to deal with it ever again. So there's that. And then option number 3 is do the work before v14 to create the primary keys. Again, you get the benefit of the fastest validation because by the time you convert to v14, the only thing you're asking 4D to do is validate your existing data. You minimize the downtime risk. You know you have no nulls. You know you have no duplicates so that when you convert to v14, you don't have to worry about losing your journal file and things like that. The one thing I really like also about this scenario or this technique is you decouple the move to primary keys from the move to v14. I like that idea. I like spreading it, breaking it up into 2 different steps, because if something else goes wrong with v14, at least you know it wasn't your primary key stuff. You didn't waste that work. So now it might sound like I'm saying do option 3. I'm really trying not to say that for sure. If you've got applications where it's going to be convenient for you to do option 1 or option 2, go ahead and do those. I'm more concerned about the largest of our customers with big data files or a lot of deployments. They might want something more like option 3. The general point, though, really is regardless of what you choose, in attending this webinar, I wanted you to be aware of what's out there and what's going to happen so that it's not a surprise. That's the main thing. I want you to be successful when you move to v14, just like I'm sure you want to be successful when you move to v14. So that's why we're doing this. That's why we're having this webinar. So that brings me to my conclusion, which is, why are we asking you to do this work? Why are we asking you to deal with this downtime? It's a totally valid question. We're very much aware. And I want to remind you what the new journaling is all about. First of all, the idea of using record numbers instead of primary keys for something like a journal is just risky. Record numbers can be reused. So we just had to stop doing that. We had to do something else besides record numbers. So it's about making the journal safe, making the journal stable. Since we're using primary keys now, the journal becomes more flexible. It becomes easier to work with. If you've ever had to deal with integrating journals in the past, if one little thing is wrong, it can basically break the whole integration. It's very, very difficult to kind of deal with unusual situations. So the new journal is more flexible. Since it's based on primary keys, the integration is safer. And it's less complex. So things like the new mirroring become possible because the new journal decreases the complexity, decreases the difficulty of integrating changes from the journal. So that's why we're making this change. It's very important, I think, for 4D to move forward and to be an enterprise application and things like that. And again, if you want to know the nitty-gritty, if you want to do comparisons against the old version and know what we changed and why, make sure you watch those videos, those presentations from Laurent. And also remind you, we will have these links up at the end of the webinar, and also they'll be emailed to you. So don't worry if you don't get a chance to write them down here. So that's it. I want to say thank you very, very much for attending this webinar. I hope that you come out of it with a good expectation of what's coming, of the work you need to do to move to v14 and what the impact is going to be for your deployment. That's the idea. That's what we're trying to do here, is just make sure that nobody's surprised and everybody's successful when they move to v14. So thank you. Thanks again for watching, and give us a moment here and we'll look at your questions.
Thanks, Josh. We would like everyone to know that we will be opening 2014 Summit registration soon. So please register and come help us celebrate 30 years of excellence. Hope to see everyone in Texas.
Okay, Aaron, thanks. Our next webinar is going to be at the same time next month on April 3rd on Thursday, 9:30 a.m. We're going to be talking about one of two parts. It's a two-part webinar. It's going to be a two-part webinar on 4D mobile. Part 1 is in April, and Part 2 will be in May.
Sorry, I know they can hear me. You don't know yet?
We're going to...
Okay, I was trying to get some inside information. Sorry, Erin's telling me she's going to cut my head off. Sorry.
No.
We don't know how much it is yet, Jack. Sorry.
Okay, on to the Q&A. Before we jump into that, let me just remind you that you can mail any questions that we don't get to in this webinar to webinar@4d.com. Here, I'm going to leave up the links, the URLs for the journaling system discussion. We've got both the US and the EU ones there. Do you want to talk about office hours, Josh?
Oh yeah. So next week. So what I wanted everybody to do is take this coming week to think about what you've seen today and how it applies to your systems. And if you have more questions or you want to discuss, come back for the office hour next week at the same time on the same day. And that will be an open mic discussion, so it won't be chat questions. And just come back if you want to talk about it. That's what we'll be there for.
Okay, and I'll leave the next webinar information up.
Okay.
So what questions do we have,
Right.
Josh?
Well, I was looking over my notes here first of all, and I realized that there's a couple of things that I wanted to mention that I forgot. Sorry. The primary key manager that I showed you the screenshot of can be used in v13. It's actually available as a component. You can find the link to it at kb.40.com in the knowledge base. So if you want to install it and use it in v13, you have that as an option. Also, with regards to how you create primary keys, whether you use SQL, whether you use the primary key manager, I want it to be clear that it doesn't affect the validation speed. The validation is just concerned with there's a primary key in the structure and there's no primary key in the data, or you're opening an older data file. How you created the primary key doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the validation speed. Also wanted to mention, in terms of the validation speed, there's very little difference between using a longint or a UUID. I tested both, and it's only about 1% slower when you use UUIDs versus longints. Now this note, actually a couple of people asked this question, and I don't mean to be confusing. So the question is, you don't need a primary key if you don't want to journal that table. And that's true. In other words, v14 has a new feature where you can turn journaling off on a per table basis. I didn't mention it in the presentation proper just because I didn't want to muddy the situation too much. You're going to use journaling for your important tables, and that's what I wanted to address. But it is technically correct that you do not need a primary key on a table if you're not going to journal that table. That's totally true. And that was it for my notes. So we can do questions. So I've had a couple of questions about the SQL code that was in the slides. Now, first thing I want to mention is we record these webinars and we will publish the recordings. So any of the information that you saw today that you might want to go back and see, we will have it available for you. I am also planning to put that SQL code in the knowledge base in kb.40.com. I don't have it up there yet, unfortunately, but I'll definitely get that up there as well. So it'll be available later.
Josh?
Yeah.
That code, can anybody just take and run it, or is it's just generic?
Well,
it has to be modified too for your
my
situation?
version is I'm creating brand new fields, and the field names are hard coded, so they may not want to do that. So you probably have to modify it anyway. One question is, sorry, it's not a question; it's a statement, really. Someone's saying the URLs don't work. I tested both of them, so I'm pretty sure they work. But if they don't work, we're going to also email those URLs to you. So we'll double check them before we email them. The formatting that you see there, u2.be, that's just YouTube's URL shortening technique. That's just what they use. It comes directly from the share link on YouTube. I think Brian's going to go check the URLs right now. Okay, some more questions. So, is there any reason to not use new primary keys versus existing fields? It's a good question. So I focused on that a bit in the presentation. I prefer using brand new fields myself because I'm going to let 4D manage them, and I'm never going to think about them, and I'm never going to worry about it. So it's certainly valid to just use new fields. It does make the validation take a little bit longer. That's true. So again, it depends on your situation. It depends on the size of your database, and it also depends on if you've already done the work to create surrogate keys in your system, then you probably want to use your existing surrogate keys, and that's fine too. You know, you can do either one. It's totally up to you. Let me go. I'm trying to do the questions backwards, and I'm realizing it's going to be too hard. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. Okay, so there was a comment that said, and this came in early, so I think by the end of the presentation it may have been clarified. But I want to make sure that everybody understands. There was a comment that said if you want to go to v14, you need to stop at v13 first and define your primary keys. Hopefully after watching the presentation you know you don't have to do that. That is one way to do it. You can create primary keys in v11, you can create them in v12, you can create them in v13, and then move to 14. That's fine. Or you can just wait till you get to 14 and create them there. You can do it either way. It's up to you. Primarily what it might affect is the validation time. That's all. The duration of the validation. There's a question, do primary keys have to be unique even against deleted records? In other words, do I have to make sure there is absolutely no way an ID gets repeated? So this is, I mentioned a philosophical distinction about primary keys, and this is very much goes to the heart of that distinction. No, there is absolutely nothing technical that prevents you from reusing a primary key value. If you want to do that, you can do that, and it's not going to, I'm trying to think of how to put this. It may not break anything obvious, but it might break something down the road. Because if you are, let's say, restoring, you're using a journal to restore, and you end up restoring a record that was deleted or something like that, and then you clobber the values, you know, it's just risky. So the idea, the philosophical idea behind a primary key is never reuse the value. That's one of the reasons why I tend to just always say UUID, and I always use UUIDs. Even though I made sure to test longins versus UUIDs when I did this webinar, I still use UUIDs most of the time, because UUIDs are globally unique. The idea with UUID is that it will never produce a duplicated value, ever. And that's across all databases on the entire planet. That's the idea with UUID. It's global for everything. So that's, you know, you don't have to use UUIDs, but that's one of the reasons why I like using them. Let's see, what else? Question about the SQL code that I posted. Do you run it in v13 or to prepare for v14, or do you run it in v14? And of course, just to reinforce the point, you can do it either way. Either way you want to do it. Yeah, a few more questions have followed that same line of thought, so hopefully that's clear now. There was a couple of questions about, so I said that primary keys need to be longint or UUID. And a couple of people asked me to confirm that that's true. And to be honest, I didn't actually check. What I mean is, everything in the documentation and everything in the product says use UUID or longint, so that's the only thing I tried. So what I'll do is I'll go double check the spec and make sure that it is actually restricted to longint or UUID. And when we send out the follow-up email, I'll make sure that that's clear and make sure that that's answered. Joe.
I'm sorry, well, I missed that. I want to make sure it's in the email.
Just the questions. All the answers are in the questions.
Yeah, they'll be there.
So as I was showing you the benchmark, somebody commented that, 4 hours for a 100 gigabyte data file on an SSD. If you're on a hard drive, it might be 8 hours. And that's, of course, we're extrapolating. We're making a linear extrapolation, and that may not be how slow it is. But you have the right idea, and that is, by doing this webinar, I wanted to make sure that everybody was thinking about, well, how long is this going to take? And what do I need to do to prepare for that? And of course, I showed you that if you use existing fields, it's much faster. So you you can cut that downtime way down. But I'm actually glad somebody made that comment also, because in my testing I did hard drive versus SSD benchmarks as well. And it was interesting that I found that the SSD wasn't that much faster. But then as I thought about it and I looked at the operating system and I looked at what it was doing, it actually started to make sense. So I'll explain why that's the case. The reason why SSDs aren't like super duper fast in this particular case with the primary key validation is when you open the database and 40 starts validating the primary keys. Meanwhile, in the background, the operating system is caching the data file. So as 40 is requesting more and more records from the data file, it's now pulling them from the system cache instead of the disk. So what I found when I was watching like the task manager or the performance monitor, the disk wasn't the bottleneck, the CPU was the bottleneck. So it was just 40 was processing the records, as quickly as it could, and so the disk didn't become a bottleneck. So what would happen is like for the first, I don't know, 5 minutes or so of the test, that the SSD was way faster. You could see the disk throughput was super high. But then the system started caching the data file and started catching up, and so it started to flatten out. And so the hard drive tests weren't, I don't think any of my hard drive tests were even double the time. They were maybe like 120% of the time of an SSD, something like that. So it was certainly slower on a hard drive, but it wasn't drastically so. So I think that's good news for those of you still using just regular disks. I think that's good to know.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
I just validated the URLs. Those
For the videos.
For the videos. The email going out has the correct one, and these ones should be correct as well.
Okay. So if you're having a problem with those YouTube URLs, as far as we know, they definitely work. What we can do is, in the email that we send, maybe we'll copy the expanded one, not the shortened one.
They're confirmed, and it's going out at the end of this.
Okay. Let's see. What else? Yeah, we did that one already. Oh yeah. Good question. How much does the data file size increase if you add brand new fields? In other words, if you add UUID fields to every single table in your database, how much bigger is the data file? For the 30 gigabyte data file that I used in the test, when I added a brand new UUID field, it went up about 700 megabytes. So, I mean, in my opinion, it's not that much for a data file that large. It's not too big of a change. So it's more, but it's not drastically more. Of course, if you use long ints, it's going to be smaller. Long ints are smaller than UUIDs. But I think between the two of them, don't pick it based on size. Pick it based on what makes sense to you. Do you want UUIDs or do you want long ints? Based on how it makes sense with your business logic and your design and things like that. Don't pick it based on the size, in my opinion, because it's between performance and size, it's not significantly different. Let's see. This is a good question. So if you decide to do the work in v13 and you choose to add new fields, so in other words, I'm going to create brand new fields in v13 to be my primary key. Or v11 or v12, it doesn't have to be v13. Do you have to run a method to fill in the data? The short answer is yes, of course. But the reason for that is, I'm trying to think how to put this. If you don't fill in the data and you move to v14, 40 will fill in the data for you. So in other words, that data filling feature is part of v14. If you decide to do the work in v13 and create brand new fields, then you probably want to fill in the data yourself so that by the time you move to v14, the validation is quick. But you don't have to. You could just leave it null. So in other words, when you create a brand new field for every table in the database, what you end up with is a bunch of null values. When you move to v14, it's going to replace those null values, assuming you set it to be an auto-generated field. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Another good question. If you use SQL to create primary keys, are all the options automatically enabled, like unique or auto-generate or anything like that? I'm glad somebody asked that. It was kind of a subtlety that I didn't necessarily want to get into the main presentation, but I did check that. I wanted to make sure. So, because you may have noticed my code doesn't really do much of anything else. For example, it doesn't add an index. I did that on purpose. So, just to be clear, when you set a primary key, whether you set it with SQL or you set it with the structure editor, unique is automatically checked and you can't turn it off. The reject null is automatically checked and you can't turn it off. The auto-generate is not automatically checked. So if you go back and look at the SQL code, either by watching the video or only when I get it posted on KB, you'll see that the auto-generate keyword is actually in the SQL statement. So I was explicitly turning that on. So auto-generate is optional. You can turn it on or off. And then finally, the index, as I said, is not optional. So I don't have to explicitly create the index with my code. All I have to do is restart the app, and 4D creates the index for me. So that's kind of nice too. It's convenient. Yeah, and so the general next question here, do you have to use auto-increment or auto-generate for your primary keys? Absolutely not. You do not have to use those settings. I recommend using those settings so that you can set it and you never have to worry about it again. Especially if you're going to create brand new fields that you're never going to use in your code anyway, just set it to auto-generate. But if you already have your own surrogate keys and you already have your own technique for making sure that values are unique and the values are not null, by all means, you can continue to go ahead and use those. The only requirement from 4D is that it be not null and it be unique. That's all. If you can ensure that, you don't have to use auto-generate. Yeah, and so somebody asked where to get the primary key manager for v14. I don't have the URL, unfortunately, off the top of my head. But if you go to kb.40.com and you search for primary key manager, you should hopefully be able to find it. I will make sure we get it sent out in the follow-up also, the Q&A follow-up.
Yeah, the Q&A follow-up.
Yeah. How do you access the primary key manager in v14? That's a good question. And it applies to v13 too, because there's a few different ways. So first of all, when you open a database in v14, and I don't mean literally convert a database, but even a v14 database that's already previously been converted, when you open it, 4D checks to see if there are any tables that don't have a primary key, but do have journaling enabled. If it finds any of those, it will pop up the dialog that I showed you in the presentation that says, hey, you're missing a primary key, but you've got journaling enabled. Do you want to run the assistant? That's one way. It does it at startup. You can also access it from the structure editor. So if you go to the structure editor in v14, in the toolbar on the top, there's a new button for the primary key manager. You can also launch it using a method. So there's a shared component method. I believe it's called 4D _primary key manager or something like that. Sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head. But the reason I mentioned that there's a method is if you install it in v13, the only way you access it is through that method, that one shared component method. It won't pop up automatically otherwise in v13 because v13 doesn't have any of the checking features built in. And there's a few other things. So let me make the general point. Every single question that you have submitted, we will answer, and we will publish those answers. We'll send you, what is it? It's an email?
Yeah, we send an email out with the link to the video from today and with the answered questions.
So even if I couldn't answer it today, we'll get you an answer. And also, don't forget about the office hour next week. So take a week to digest what you've seen and the answers that I've given. And if you have more questions, come back next week and we'll discuss it.
It does take us a few days to get all this together, to get the video published and everything. I'm going to try to get it out definitely before the office hour next week, so you have a chance to review the questions and think about it.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
We really glad to get this info out, and we will see you next week if you choose to come to office hour. Otherwise, next month for the next webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.